Welcome to Wagon Wheel. I'm Jarrod Kimber. Let us start the show with questions from the audience, because that's what Wagon Wheel is. You ask questions, I answer them. This goes on for quite a while. If you're in the YouTube and you are desperate to ask a question, the best way, of course, is to do it with a super chat. But any comments there are welcome. But if you want to make sure that if you're not the sort of person who can make sure that you're always on our lives, and being that our lives are stretched right across the day, I don't know how you ever could be. Patreon is the best way for Wagon Wheel to get your questions in, which is what I can't read this because Buku's made it the most incomprehensible font I've ever seen in my life. Hamza says, oh my God. Why is Shoaib Bashir? His numbers are dreadful. Not even who is Shoaib Bashir. I think England are doing a similar thing to what Australia did, the sort of Matt Kuhnemann thing, whereas rather than getting spinners that they don't necessarily trust, I think, let me rephrase that. Rather than getting spinners that they don't necessarily think are test quality or international quality players anyway, they would rather look for spinners who are particularly more suited to Asian conditions. Now, if you listen to, or if you read Matt Roller's article with Rob Key, I'm not sure that everything that Rob Key says completely fits and makes a lot of sense. However, the general principle is that they are looking for people who bowl at a certain pace, who put side spin on the ball. And that's the position they've seen. They're not as worried about their domestic numbers. And you know, there is something to be said for, in certain positions, and probably fast bowling and Asian spin are two big ones, you actually want to look beyond your first class competition. I think your first class numbers are really, really important. And I think we've even seen with Zach Crawley the limitations of someone who doesn't make runs consistently at first class cricket. And it's the same for a bowler. If you pick a bowler who's never been taking any first class wickets before and you take them to test cricket, there are going to be things that they are going to struggle with, the game in and game out situation. But what they are doing here is they think that the wickets are going to rag when they play India. I think that they need height and pace and side revolutions on the ball. And Liam Dawson doesn't really do any of those things for them. So they are looking to replicate the kind of bowlers that they get, that India might pick. So that means they've picked a couple of guys who haven't done a lot at the moment. Rob Key talks about it a little bit along the lines of the fact that, you can't really pick England. You can't pick spinners to play test matches for England based on how they do in England in county games, because the pitches are just not set up for that. And it's very, very true. Jack Leach averaged, I think, 12 more away from Hyderabad than he did at home, right? So, and that was it. That was, peak young, hungry Jack Leach. So there is always an issue there. So no, I can understand it, but I can also understand why people are saying, who is this person? But I suppose it was the same with Matt Kuhnemann. I think that makes more sense than taking someone over you don't really believe in the first place. But I would have thought that I would have taken one young spinner and Liam Dawson, probably, rather than two young spinners in case something went wrong. Rudra says, rank the Indian pace bowling Kumars. Bhuvi, Vinay, Praveen, Mukesh. Well, Bhuvi's first, isn't he? Praveen is second. Oh, might be too early on Mukesh. I was never a big Vinay Kumar fan. I thought he was... I didn't think he was an international quality player. So I certainly wouldn't have him as high. Praveen was incredible. Bhuvi was probably just that little bit better. But Praveen is, you would have him on that sort of Muhammad Abbas, Muhammad Asif, Vernon Philander kind of accuracy and control over the ball scale. Absolutely wonderful, some of the things he did. As I said, Mukesh still in development. Vinay Kumar was his first ball in Test cricket hit for 6 by David Warner. Am I remembering that right? I remember I did a polite inquiries that day, and it sort of said, look, he's never going to play Test cricket again. And people got so angry. but it was a stretch. He was the wrong bowler for the wrong pitch as well. Like a lot of things went wrong for him. Thinking back to that particular test match, but yeah, Boovy's number one, right? Rudra says, what hypothetical test attack would you rather have, assuming them all at their peak with the knowledge that they had? Okay. Stain, Mitchell Johnson, Bumrah, Ambrose versus McGrath, Philander, Anderson, Asif. Attempted to have a higher pace attack versus lower pace attack, but more skillful. Would you take their batting into account? Well, if you took their batting into account, I don't think it matters here, does it? Because Philander and Mitch Johnson are of a similar quality. And then you've got Bumrah, Ambrose, and Stain of a similar quality. So batting I don't think makes any difference there. Okay, so if we're talking about peak of their powers, you would have Stain, Mitchell Johnson, Bumrah, and Ambrose versus McGrath, Philander, Anderson, Asif. You would pick the faster bowlers. And the reason being that you still have, I mean, I'm just looking at this lineup that you've put in here, Rudra, but you've still got Stain, Bumrah, and Ambrose. So you've still got three bowlers who have like a high level of skill. In Bumrah and Ambrose, elite skill plus pace. Stain, brilliant skill, maybe not quite elite, but right up there anyway. So I would think that would be the much better option from that point of view. Because when the pitch does get flat, who's going to do your grunt work on the other team? Who's going to bowl short spells of bouncers? Maybe McGrath. It's not really his thing, though, is it? Whereas on the other one, you can get Mitchell Johnson to do that, but Dale Steyn can do that as well. And Ambrose could do that, or Bumrah could do it. So I would think for a test attack that those first four are better suited than the second four. It's why we don't have as many, not that those guys are all military medium, but it's why we don't have as many military medium type attacks, right? It's not that you don't want skillful bowlers. It's that when the pitch isn't doing anything, you need something different. And if you look at the attack that you've got there, McGrath, Philander, Anderson, Asif, other than McGrath's height, you don't really have much difference. Whereas if you go to the other attack, Stain is skiddier, Mitchell Johnson is left arm, and then you have one guy in Bumrah has a bit of a weird action, and Ambrose is really, really tall. I don't know what Bumrah's release is, but I don't think he's quite at their level, Ambrose's level. But that's four very, very different bowlers. Whereas in Philander and Anderson and Asif, yes, you've probably got one seamer there, one wobble ball swing bowler, and one combination of both. They kind of overlap a lot more. So yeah, no, I'd definitely go with that first lot. And that's not to say the first lot are better bowlers. It's just that is a better combination. Satchmo says, what is your favorite test innings that you've seen live? My favorite test innings that I've seen live. I mean, I was at the Ben Stokes innings, but is that my favorite? The Angelo Matthews one at Headingley. In fact, I've seen a lot of good innings at Headingley. I thought was fantastic and probably even more surprising than what Ben Stokes did. KP in Colombo, I was there for that. Saywag at the MCG, certainly another one. Trying to think of some of the others I've seen. I was at Tino Best's innings and Ashton Agar. They were both a lot of, if you're looking at fun, they were certainly both a lot of fun. Callis at the MCG drawing a test against Warren was, from a technical point of view, incredible. In some ways, very similar to the Ben Stokes thing, but without the hitting at the end, I suppose. What's my favorite, though? I think my favorite innings of all time is probably Matthew Elliott at the MCG in a Shield game against New South Wales, which doesn't really help you because you've asked for test innings. Yeah, the Angelo Matthews one would be really, really high for me. Virat's second 100 at Adelaide would probably be very high. I saw Smith and Pune, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I have a great. The Callis one keeps coming back to me, but I was quite young then, and It was just a really okay. I think the best innings I've seen live is AB de Villiers at Pretoria against Mitchell Johnson when Mitchell Johnson was still at full Mitchell Johnsonness. And I don't think he made 100. Let me just try and find it as quickly as I can. Yeah, I don't think he made 100 in that game. What year was that? 2013, 2014. So let's have a look. Was it 91? Yeah, so he made 91 at Centurion. So Australia made 397, and South Africa got bowled out for 206. And let's have a look. Johnson took 7 for 68, and AB de Villiers played him like it was me bowling to him. I think that's the innings I remember the most, because the difference between the way he batted and everyone else, the difference, and it wasn't just that test, right? That was the 6th test in a row Mitchell Johnson had been doing that. And even the players who Mitchell Johnson hadn't been dismissing had not looked comfortable against him. And then suddenly AB de Villiers looked like just a different, like, I don't know. I saw peak Lara, I saw peak Sachin, I saw peak Ponting, obviously peak Smith as well, Coley. AB de Villiers at his best was probably a different level than everyone else. And perhaps is because of his weird career in the end, he may not be remembered on the level of some of those other guys. But I don't think I've ever seen anyone pick the ball up earlier than him. And to be able to do that against Mitchell Johnson and that Mitchell Johnson, which was maybe one of the best bowlers of all time, that short peak that Mitchell Johnson had, the 6 tests. Yeah, I think it was 6 tests. That was the last one. And then he got on the slow pitch after that and started to struggle. Was about as good as anyone. I remember being afraid for batters against Mitchell Johnson at times, and then suddenly AB de Villiers making it look different. So I think that's probably my favorite innings of all time. Muku has gone nuts with these questions, everyone. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 8. James says, I heard an incident in a Victoria Pakistan Touri game in the late 80s, early 90s, in which Pakistan walked off in protest against the umpiring. Do you know more details about this? It was Intikhab Alam, wasn't it? Intikhab Alam was the former leg spinner, Pakistan manager. I think I'm trying to remember the full details of it. Oh my God, I've just brought up. I've just brought up this thing, and I've just seen something that he called the players years later. But let me just see if I can find this. Intikhab. Oh no, I can't find it. Yeah, I can't remember the full story. But yeah, there was an issue with the umpiring. Unfortunately, I keep seeing where he said a very abusive thing about all the players. I'm trying to remember what it was, but yeah, I should know more about this because I certainly remember remember it, but I can't remember exactly what happened at that time. Boop, 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 boop. But I know he was very upset with, I think, just a series of LBWs. I don't think it was anything particularly full on from what I remember. But it was a very weird thing because it was a tour game. And it's just not the kind of thing that you would normally associate with people getting that fiery about. But he's certainly like, I mean, you only need to have a look at some of the things that he has done over the years. The things he's called players and everything else. He clearly has a bit of a temper and everything else. Wait, I just want to see if this is stuff. No, I can't find it. Sorry. But yeah, it is one of the weirder ones. But there's been some really weird moments in tour games over the years. If you go back, so one of the more famous ones is Alan Border, Craig McDermott having a full-on fight on the field. So occasionally tour games do have something to them. And I remember Victoria annoying the Indians. Well, actually, the Indians annoyed Victoria. I can't remember what the full thing was, but I think Victoria asked for a game where like each team would bat a certain amount of overs or whatever, in order. Yeah, I think that's right. And then India decided that they wanted to bat longer, and the Victorians were annoyed, and so the Victorians then batted for 2 days, and so none of the Indians got any batting practice in the second innings. I think they ended up batting very, very late or something. So there has been acrimony in. It makes it just sound like it's Victorians, but maybe it is. But there has been acrimony in some of those tour games before. There was one other game where I think it was a county tour game where one team annoyed the touring team so much that the touring team essentially didn't have all of its 11 out on the field. Like they had like, I don't know, physios, whatever, but not as we're resting anyone, but just as what's the point in this game. So those things have happened before, but I can't remember the specific one with Intercub. I just think there was a couple of decisions they thought had gone against them, and he got a little bit heated, and I think there was maybe a couple of tempers out on the field as well, but I can't remember the full story off the top of my head. James said, could a spinner gain any advantage by bowling with the new ball? With the harder seam grip and turn more, could an off spinner use the shine to bowl an arm ball that would swing either way? Well, I mean, James, we do have spinners that bowl with the new ball already and get an advantage. Not all spinners can grip the new ball. It's slippery, and the new seam actually makes it even tougher to get between your fingers if you're a finger spinner. If you're a wrist spinner, the lacquer on the ball sort of slides onto your hand a little bit, which means you can lose control of the ball. That's why not all spinners do it. So yes, that is the case. The reason they don't do it is it's not that the new ball is not an advantage for spinners, because I think we now know that it can be. It's more that why would you want to give up the advantage of your seam bowlers in that position? But India regularly do it now, and so it is a case. But around the world, you would still be much better off, certainly outside of Asia, giving a new ball to a seam bowler than you would be to a spinner. But there are certain pitches where that probably isn't the case, and we'll see more spinners bowling with the new ball. When it comes down to it, maybe not the brand new ball, but certainly the ball between 10 overs and 30 over mark, you really want your spinner to bowl in that period when the ball is hard, because it will spin faster. Can it spin more with a new ball? Sometimes. It doesn't happen. I think it's a bit more. I think the spin is more inconsistent with a new ball than it is with an old ball. Whether it spins more, and I think sometimes it probably can, because that seam will grip, but you probably can't land on that exact part of the ball consistently enough to cause those kinds of issues. Trying to think of the best way of kind of putting this, James, it's kind of like a situation where you have there will be a certain advantage to bowling spin with a new ball, but is that over seam bowling with a new ball? Right? So once you use that spinner with the brand new ball, you are really taking away the advantage of a seamer, whereas a spinner with the ball from overs 10 to 30 is still going to have an advantage bowling with that ball. They're still going to have enough of a seam there. But yeah, there's no doubt that it can help spinners at times. It's just that it also helps quick bowlers. It's a bit like it's it's a bit like using a pinch hitter, who you'd say, well, if they're batting at number 8, they might average, I don't know, let's say 15. But if they bat at if they open the batting, they might average 17 or 18. And so, yeah, it would be better to have them there, but you're also pushing down someone else who would also be more suited to opening the batting. Hamza says, rank these 8 teams in T20 internationals, best to worst. Oh my God. T20 internationals. I don't know, man. We just came out of an ODI World Cup, Hamza. Ireland, Zimbabwe, Scotland, Netherlands, Uganda, USA, Namibia, Nepal. If we're talking about the best chance of, winning games, I suppose Zimbabwe and Netherlands are probably at the top of that list. I would think in T20 cricket, with Scotland and Ireland and Namibia just behind them in a group, and then Nepal, USA, and Uganda. I don't know enough about Nepal or Uganda at the moment to make a huge comment on either of those teams. I've seen a little bit more of the USA. I'm pretty confident that they're in that third tier. But yeah, I would have thought Zimbabwe and Netherlands probably just a tier above everyone else there. And then Scotland should be better than Ireland, but they've maybe taken a slight step back of recent times. And Namibia, I really like as a bowling team, but obviously worry about their batting a little bit. And I'd still have Ireland in that section. You know, they did well in the last T20 World Cup. So I think there's three clear tiers there, having a look at it off the top of my head. But I don't think there's that much between tier 1 and tier 2. I would think there should be a clear gap between tier 2 and tier 3. Having said that, Zimbabwe just didn't qualify for the World Cup, right? And I've got them in the top tier, which I don't know what that says about their cricket at the moment. So maybe I'm overranking them a little bit. Would we ever, Ali says, would we ever see consolidation of T20 leagues? So I've been talking about this from the start. I think that was the big era that a lot of boards made. This whole idea of we need a league and we need a league. Does New Zealand need a league? Really? What's the top end of a New Zealand T20 league, right? The much better thing for New Zealand would have been a situation where they had. That's the best way of looking at it. 4 teams. So you have 6 teams in Australia. You have 4 teams in New Zealand. Both teams have then a mini tournament as well, which is, you know, a proper domestic tournament, which is run a lot cheaper. That can be done over, you know, month and a half leading into the main tournament if you had to. And you can do it that way. I think that would be much better if you're doing that in that particular way. That's an obvious one. Oh, is Mookie just like taking things off my screen now? I'm trying to think of. I always said that Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan should have a league, and I suppose then you would throw in UAE. I suppose maybe Nepal, Oman, but perhaps not straight away. South Africa, there's no reason for South Africa and Zimbabwe to have leagues. Namibia would also be in that league as well. So yet again, you know, maybe not Uganda, but Uganda and Kenya would be other teams that you would be thinking about there. England should be England, Ireland, Netherlands, Scotland in their league. I'd still be thinking about bringing 100 teams in from some of those other cities. What else? What else is on option there? Trying to think of some of the others that I've thought of combining. Oh yeah, Canada, USA, and CPL. Again, shouldn't be 3 different leagues. It should all be 1 league. I don't think we'll ever have a promotion relegation set up, and the reason for that is that those teams would only come in with the, you know, understanding that they are part of the league, that they have a part ownership in the league. So, you know, that the England setup, like, or the English football or the European football setup, I don't think will ever happen again, just because teams don't want to be in a situation where they can be relegated, right? I just don't think the American system of owning a slice of the league and not being able to be relegated is the way that we're going to see things going forward. Even if you could argue that promotion relegation is a much better system, which I certainly would. I don't think we're going to see that ever again in that kind of environment anyway. But yes, I don't think all these different places need leagues. I think it's stupid. I don't think they're going to make the money that they think they are. I think they all made a mistake. They all were chasing something that they were never going to get to. So I thought from the start this was the best way of doing it, and I still think it's the best way of doing it, but I don't see a way back now. I think the PSL is too big. Australia, New Zealand could be an interesting one over the next couple of years. If you took it from 8 to 12 teams, and, you know, there's already rugby and basketball precedents over there, I think that would actually strengthen the Big Bash. I think it would make it more interesting as well. Whether Cricket New Zealand would want to lose some of their authority over a league, that is the question, because the bigger team's always going to have the more power, right? Or the bigger board's always going to have the more power. I can only see how it would help Zimbabwe and Namibia to have that, but whether South Africa would be interested in it now with the SA20 is probably doubtful. As I said, PSL is probably already too big, and I think Major League Cricket and CPL, like, they're two different companies now, so I can't see them merging together. And also, I think Major League Cricket probably would be thinking to themselves, we don't need the CPL, and the CPL doesn't offer us anything specific that we need. Doesn't mean that they can't eventually come together, but I thought this was a big problem. We should have been in a position in cricket where we actually had the ability to do this, because we are an international-led sport. And then you could have had 6 teams in Pakistan and 4 teams in Sri Lanka and 4 teams in Bangladesh. That's a really, really interesting league, and you still have your home teams play. There aren't that many games where Bangladesh and Sri Lankan teams are playing each other that doesn't appeal to Pakistanis. Also, you can have the ability to have Pakistanis in those other teams, right? They don't all have to be from those places, and Bangladeshis can play in the Pakistan teams and everything. That, I think, is all really interesting going ahead, but it's not going to happen. Well, I shouldn't say it's not going to happen. It's certainly, if it is going to happen, there's going to only be a couple of rare occasions of it happening. Ian says, I recently read Marcus Trescothick's autobiography. I do believe things have improved since then, but I wondered if you thought cricket, because of its structure, was particularly bad sport for players' mental health. The distances traveled, the time away from families, long periods of the game you can't influence. Look, I know David Frith has obviously written a book. I want to say it's got silence in it anyway, about player suicide in cricket. I think Gideon Haigh has suggested that perhaps we over-egg the amount of suicides within cricket compared to other sports, which is possible. Maybe we were just the first sport to notice it. Certainly, I think boxing's had a lot of suicide as well, although how many of those have probably been brought about by CTE, which is probably not the case in cricket as much anyway. So it is a sport that, if you're an English cricketer in the, 1920s, you are committing 6 to 7 months away from your family to go to tour Australia or New Zealand or South Africa, those sorts of places. That is just not like other sports. You're then with a team, but it's not a team sport 100%, is it? It's a team sport with individual pursuits wrapped around it, which makes it a little bit trickier. It's a little bit different than, say, a code of football or rugby or basketball, even though they all have individual elements to them, obviously. It's just different. It's very hard if you play in a game of cricket and you don't make any runs or take any wickets, even if you win and do other positive things, to feel the impact of it. Whereas I think in rugby or football, you can certainly do those sorts of things. So yeah, no, I do think there is elements of that. But I think probably it's less to do with the sport, although I'm not saying that doesn't play a part, and more to do with the actual travel and days away. That would be my guess, but I don't know. I don't know if enough research has been done into those sorts of things and how they work, if we're being honest. Because if you think about tennis players away almost as long. They're more on their own. If you're not in the top 100, you probably aren't traveling with a coach. You're probably traveling on your own. You will be traveling maybe within a friendship group, but even then there's separations because you go to different tournaments at different times. And your friendship group are still people you have to compete against, right? Your practice is literally just hitting the ball back over there over and over and over again. Far more repetitive than cricket, far less interesting than cricket. Again, most of those tournaments are what? I suppose smaller tournaments are about a week and a half long. If you're out in the first round, you've got a week and a half of nothing to do. So I'm not sure that cricket is more brutal than tennis, right? So I'm picking one sport. I think there's lots of really, really interesting sports out there. Like, if you're a punter in the NFL, right? Like, no one respects you, and you do about 10 seconds of work a day, right? Like, what, for 18 games a year, or however many games a year they currently play. So I think there's lots of sports that have those elements to them. The travel element, or the loneliness, or the limited actual chance to shape a game, or whatever that may be. I wonder if sometimes we project, and it's just the fact that cricket traditionally, and even now, just has too much travel in it. And because of that too much travel, that is what a lot of the mental health issues that just come from that. Patrick says, is there Victorian cricket that you think more people should know about? James Sutherland? No. I think Max Walker is and I suppose he's a Tasmanian cricketer, but obviously played for Victoria, is a cricketer who in Australia is incredibly famous. And I think, maybe the last generation doesn't know him as well, but certainly 20 or 30 years ago was a fantastically interesting person. I don't even know how you would explain Max Walker, but he wrote books all the time with, let me try and read you the name of, let's have a look. Max Walker books. See if I can find here the names of some of these books. How to Hypnotize Chooks, How to Kiss a Crocodile, The Wit of Walker. There's all these bizarre books that he was involved with over the years that don't really with these incredibly terrible. How to Tame Lions, is that one of them? I think. How to Puzzle a Python. So he did that. He's also obviously a TV host. He was also, I don't know, a raconteur afterwards. And in Australia, he's probably more well known now as a TV presenter and a bit of a, I don't know, weird guy. But Max Walker was, at first, he's a professional athlete. I think he played 2 sports professionally. His bowling average in Test cricket was 27 with an economy of 2.25, and he did that with a bowling action that looked barely legal. In 34 matches, he took 138 wickets. Could bat a little bit too, like in that sort of Mitch Johnson, Mitch Stark style of batting, as in, I mean, he was probably more of a high performing Jason Gillespie in some ways. But the point being is he could hold a bat as well. Just a really interesting, weird career, and he ends up becoming a laughingstock on the 12th Man tapes, of course. Kind of had this eager way about him, very big, strong guy. So I think there's a lot of interesting parts to his career that, because Max Walker kind of became famous in another way, we didn't talk about him as a cricketer as much as we should have. I'm trying to think of any other Victorian cricketers that, I mean, Jamie Siddons is obviously one that if you're a 90s head, you probably would have heard of and never saw anything of. Just a fantastic cricketer who probably, by not playing county cricket, and maybe some of the years he didn't play county cricket was because he was playing football. Again, a 2-sport athlete. And then got very sick on a tour for Australia and never really recovered. But he was an incredible player, middle order player when the War Brothers existed, was probably his biggest flaw. And not playing county cricket, or not playing enough county cricket to make his averages look great the way that a lot of other players did, was maybe another issue. He was obviously fantastic. I don't think enough is talked about Simon O'Donnell. Him and Franklin Stevenson are, incredibly important figures in our game for inventing the slow balls we use today. And neither of them are really given enough credit from that. Simon O'Donnell was a very interesting cricketer. Like, again, one of those guys who would be a $1 million player. I'm trying to think what he would be like in modern. He kind of be like Andrew Tye with Chris Morris's batting, perhaps. He's probably a better batter than Chris Morris as well, Simon O'Donnell. But, just a big, strong guy, really interesting cricketer in that era. Those 3 come off the top of my head. Troy Corbett's, of course, one of the most interesting ones, of a guy who bursts onto the scene, takes 40 wickets and an average of 11 in list A cricket. There's rumors that he chucks it and we never see him again. just disappears. But yeah, I mean, this is not a good question, Patrick. I could be doing this for hours. Let's have a quick break here. And when we come back, we'll get more questions. And of course, anything you want to put in the chat, we can get to. This is the Wagon Wheel. I am Jarrod Kimber. So if you need a VPN, go Nord. Use nordvpn.com/Kimber to get a huge discount off your Nord VPN plan, plus 4 additional months for free. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the show notes. Protect your computer like a cricketer protects its nether region with NordVPN today. All right, welcome back. Let's see what else we have here. What was that? Patrick. Niran says, hey, Jarrod, I just re-listened to your podcast about how Test cricket should be played in a franchise format because it should be the best versus the best. I agree with most of that, but wouldn't we miss out on the charm of Roston Chase getting an 8 for or Kusal Pereira getting 153? Isn't romanticizing below average players, good performances, part of what makes Test cricket so great? No, because we'd still have below average players if we had the best of the best, right? Like the NBA is the best of the best, you know, Champions League is best of the best. You still have other players coming through that shouldn't be there that do great performances. That doesn't take anything away from those players. What it means is that the players who do those kinds of performances are still are of an even better quality, right? Like, so no, you can't create a sporting league where you don't have Roston Chases and Kusal Pereiras, because they're always going to exist. You're always going to have players who surprise you, whether it be for one series or one game or over a long period of time, whether it's best of the best or even if it's not best of the best. That doesn't change that at all, because you're comparing Kusal. You're saying that these guys are below average players, right? There's going to be below average players at every league of every level of sport that you ever look at. That doesn't change at all. Niran says, thoughts on Chamari Adapatsu snub? I think we talked about it in Uncovered, but just very quickly, I think she's probably a victim of maybe another player was available in her position at the same time. I think Indian women's cricket is stronger in the top order, which is probably, you know, where she's going to play. But we've seen very good players. If it was a deeper league, she would certainly be in it. But it's a bit of a shallow league at the moment when it comes to overseas players. It's also a very small league. I don't think this is suggesting she's not in the most, you know, easily in the top 44 most talented women in the world. But that's not what this is it? You're looking at a finite amount of overseas players. You're looking at teams trying to fill roles within those overseas players. And, you know, and there was another player on the market who did a lot of the same things that she does. I think you certainly make the argument that Danny Wyatt was at least at Chamari's level, if not above it, if you look at the fact that she could field as well, all those different things. But, you know, if Chamari had gone and Danny Wyatt hadn't been in, that also would have been probably a mistake. The point is there aren't enough spots. And so talented players in the women's Premier League are going to miss out occasionally, right? I've already done that one. Ian? James says, as discussions continue about who will replace David Warner at the top of the order following his planned retirement, one name that doesn't get mentioned is Will Pucovski, who in his only test to date scored 60 on debut against India before dislocating his shoulder. Obviously, it's well known that Will has suffered from concussions in the past. Do you think that Australian selectors have put a line through Pucovski, or do you think he may very well end up playing for Australia again and have the career the Australian cricket fans were hoping for? Look, I think the thing with Will Pucovski, and let me just bring up his stats very, very quickly here. But I think the problem is that it's not that the Australian selectors are like, well, he's never going to be any good or anything. I mean, from a very young age, they had him flagged. And, you know, I would say that he's probably the one of the most fated players, you know, batting talents. I'm trying to think of another one. I mean, Jake Doran was probably one that they had very high hopes for. Haven't been a lot of them coming through in a long time. So Will is right up there from that kind of point. But he's got to stay on the park, right? He's had injuries, whether it be mental or physical, that keep him off the ground. He has played 34 first-class matches, but let's just have a look. Where are we here? He's played 34 first-class matches in 6 years. So what month are we in? We're in December. So he's played 5 games in a row this year. He's got a top score of 39. Oh, no, he made 65 against South Australia, didn't he, in the second innings? So he's made 1 half century in, 5 Shield games. He hadn't played for a year before then. He hasn't made 100 in first-class cricket since 2020, where he made a double 100 against Western Australia. So he made the 2 double 100s. Was that in a week? Yeah. 255 against South Australia, 202 against Western Australia. So he hasn't made a first-class 100 in that time. He's obviously been subbed out of games. He's made 4 50s in the last 3 years in first-class cricket. It's not a problem of talent with him because, we have seen him in Test cricket. We've seen the incredible. I mean, that he's made 3 double hundreds, I want to say, in 30 games. He does seem a little bit feast or famine, I think is probably fair to say with him as well. But yeah, it's not a problem with talent. It's not a problem with composure. It's not a problem with any of those things. He needs to make runs consistently in first-class level, so that they can trust him to play Test cricket again. He needs to play games consistently as well, which he's just started doing again. There are multiple issues that he has to overcome that other players don't. Talent is not one of them for him, though, right? And if he makes a couple of scores in a row, he's a very big chance of replacing David Warner. I think the issue that, and I haven't talked to any Australian selectors about this is just off the top of my head. I think the issue that they will have is, if they pick him as do they not need an automatic backup just because they would be afraid that something would happen and you would have to move him around? Jake says, what approach do you think is better for England picking spinners to tour India? Pick the spinners with the most proven experience, regardless of whether they suit the conditions, or pick the players with little experience who potentially have attributes that could translate well to Test cricket? Or are they stuck between a rock and a hard place? There is no good option. Well, I mean, the third one, that bit's probably true. I think you probably need a combination. You have Jack Leach, who has experience in Asia. So you've got your experienced spinner that you have available there. You have a wrist spinner in Rehan Ahmed. If and it looks like they're going to go with those 2 spinners to begin with. I think, as I said at the top of the show, they've then picked 2 inexperienced spinners as their backups. I think if you're going to go with 4 spinners, I probably would have tried to convince Liam Plunkett, I almost said Liam Dawson, to go out. So Rob Key said something really interesting. He said Liam Dawson probably doesn't want to sit on the bench as a backup in this tour. I do wonder if they asked him if that was the case, but it felt like they were going to go with the younger spinners anyway. I probably would have had one more experienced spinner, but I don't think you can play Liam Dawson and Jack Leach in the same side anyway, and they don't have another off spinner now that Moeen Ali is gone that they feel that comfortable with. I know Will Jacks took wickets in his Test match, but we also know Will Jacks is not a frontline spinner and is a long way off that. But he would have been the other option. Not massively experienced, but certainly has played Test matches and is an international cricketer now. BM says, can't get over the World Cup loss. What hurts more is some of my favorite cricket podcasts seem to suggest over and over again that India lost because they messed with the pitch. Well, they didn't lose because they messed with the pitch. Although you could argue it didn't help. So here's the question, and I've asked you this before. Have you? When did you ask me this before? Did India cheat or something? Did they cheat? Ooh, that's an interesting one because where does this idea come from, and why do all the Western journalists believe this? The great cricketer, final word. Well, I can't explain why they believe it, but I've talked to people within the Indian camp, and they have said that the pitch was changed to assist them, I should say. What we might never be able to find out is who changed it, whether the team actually asked for it or not, who was involved in the decision, whether it was an overzealous BCCI official. the ICC is supposed to overlook those pitches. They're supposed to be done to ICC specifications in World Cups. They're not supposed to be done for the local team. We had 2 occasions in the semi-final and the final where pitches were changed at the last minute. If you have a look at those 2 games, neither of those pitches are, and this is what I've been saying a long time. If they were trying to fix the pitches for India, they didn't pick the right pitches. The right pitch would have been making a wicket that spun sideways. And if that was the case, India would have dropped Siraj and would have brought Ashwin in. The fact, and that's what they did for the early game against Australia, right? Not that I'm saying that pitch was changed. I think that was just a normal pitch. But when they had the opportunity to go with that lineup, they did it. The fact that they didn't do it means that even if the pitch was changed, it wasn't really changed to assist India. There's no way you could beat India in a World Cup. Like if you wanted to doctor wickets for India for a World Cup, you would just use the test wickets, right? There are, when you have a semi-final on a used pitch, when you have a pitch in a final that is, that has been slowed down, which probably didn't make it as good a contest, right? That clearly someone did something here, and the ICC have been very quiet on it. But I could say, behind the scenes, they believe that India were involved in all that sort of stuff. Having said that, did Rahul Dravid or Rohit Sharma ask for this? Or Virat Kohli or whoever, in those sorts of situations? That's the bit I don't think happened. I think it was an overzealous BCCI person. Whether it was Jay Shah, no idea. Whether it was someone far less important than him, I have no idea. But I do think that is what happened. And so there is a bit of schadenfreude in the fact that they had the best team already, right? They didn't need to change the pitches. They just needed to play to their, their full potential. And by changing this particular pitch, they brought Pat Cummins into the game a little bit more when Pat Cummins hadn't had a very good tournament. So whoever changed the pitch, and for whatever reason, that the 2 wickets were changed in the semi-final and the final, I don't think it really assisted India. And so I think that is where a lot of the schadenfreude kind of thing comes in, plus the fact they lost, of course, the final. But if you were trying to tamper with those wickets for India, then they did a terrible job, because I could tamper with the wicket now and make it better for India. So I don't think all the wickets were in the favor of India, but I do think, having chatted some people that know a lot of this stuff, and in various different places, because I've been trying to get to the truth of this a little bit myself, and I haven't been able to. Like, I know that the wickets were changed. I know that the surface was changed. I know that there is certainly a belief from certain people who work in cricket, not necessarily ICC employees, but people around the ICC who believe that it was done by Indian officials in order to help India win. But again, if they did that, then they did a horrible job of it, which is part of where the people laughing at them comes from. But I don't know how to square off all that, because it is so rumor based and innuendo based. But I think if you have a World Cup semi-final that is on a used pitch when it doesn't need to be on a used pitch, you automatically, there are questions to be asked here. And I don't think the ICC had full power over those grounds, and I don't know how they ever could in India, right? And so you certainly have all that, but that pitch was not the one I would have given India. Well, if we're talking about the final wicket, and even the semi-final wicket, I'm not sure those are the wickets that I would have given India if I wanted to do that. So again, I don't want to betray anyone's trust here, but I'm trying to think of the best way of saying this. If you asked India exactly for the wickets they wanted in the semi-final and the final, they did not get them. All right, I'm talking about the Indian team here. But there is an element, and if you go through my work over the last 2 World Cups talking about India when they've lost, there is an element that Indian cricket is so terrified of losing at the moment, right? And that that's not just the players and the coaches. That's kind of the whole structure of Indian cricket. It's so terrified of losing that the way it was passed on to me was, I know we might never be able to prove this, but the way it was passed on to me was that someone changed the surfaces in both cases. So changed the type of surface it was in the final, and I think the actual surface for the semi-final, if I remember correctly. They did that because they thought that that would help guarantee India a victory, right? Whether they were experts enough in cricket and what they were asking for to get the surfaces that India wanted seems like there's a disconnect there. Now, I could be wrong, and maybe that isn't what happened, and it was someone in the team who directly asked for it, and then the groundsman just couldn't give them exactly what they wanted. Maybe that wicket in the final was supposed to spin more, right? And it just didn't. I don't know. And the truth is that no one knows. But when you're talking about the idea that they messed with the pitch, well, something went on with those two wickets. I don't think anyone can deny that when we have the information from the semi-final, right? And as I said, this comes from within Indian cricket. I have also been told that and this isn't from Western sources. This is directly from the team that they believe that the wicket was changed with them in mind for the final as well. But whether it was changed the way that they would have asked for it is kind of what I'm saying. So the ICC has a pitch a head of pitches that is supposed to oversee all the ICC events. But in most countries, they're obviously going to have the most power. In India, that is not the case. And there are so many external people. It could have been a local politician, right? It could have been an eager a person on a board, or an eager groundsman, right? Like, all these things are possible, and that's part of the issue why it's so hard to tell. But I find it very hard to think that Rohit Sharma and Rahul Dravid did this. And the reason I would say this is because a seaming wicket would still have helped India. A fast wicket would still have helped India. A great batting wicket would still have helped India, right? The only wicket that I would say that wouldn't have given India an advantage in that final would have been one with extra bounce. That one really would have helped the Australians with Hazelwood, Mitchell Marsh, and Mitch Stark, right? That extra height. That's the only wicket that wouldn't have helped India. Every other wicket, India just had a better team. Better and deeper batting. They had 5 frontline bowling options. They had better spinning. Their seam bowlers were in better form. Like, every step of the way, they were absolutely better. So changing the wicket, as I said, if it was such a full-on wicket that was helping India, they would have used the third spinner. That would have been it, because there's no way Australia would have been able to compete with that, right? You've got Zampa, Maxwell, and Head going up against Ashwin, Kuldeep, and Jadeja on a spinning wicket. Like, oh my God, it's like taking a water pistol to a nuclear bomb competition, right? Like, what are we talking about here? So that's the bit that it makes me think a little bit differently about the whole situation. But there's Schadenfreude, I think, in general. There was a lot of crowing. Someone put up a tweet during the World Cup of going, of course, Australia dominated the old World Cup. Like, you were playing against malnutritioned Indians, and was it Civil War Sri Lankans, and poor people from the West Indies, and I can't remember, unprofessional English, whatever it was. And I went through all the reasons why Australia used to dominate. And now, finally there is a true superpower type thing. There's a lot of stuff like that going on. And it doesn't happen on my kind of stuff. Although there was a day when we got absolutely bombarded with, me and Bayram got absolutely bombarded with feedback from Indian fans about how we had dared to say that they hadn't completely dominated every moment of every game. And all I was doing, of course, was normal analysis. And we had said that they were the best team and everything else. But there was an element of that, and I don't get that as much as I'm sure the Great Cricketer and the Final Word would get, because they more project as Australian shows. And so they do get naturally attacked, I think, from Indian fans at times. We don't really get that as much here, just because if you're here, you kind of know that I'm talking about all cricket, and it's cricket comes before nationality on my channel, especially if you've been around here for a while. So it is a little bit different, the dynamics and everything else with that, the people involved and everything else. But if you're asking if something happened to the pitches, then I think we know something happened to the pitches, right? And when India didn't lose, that all came to a head, a little bit. And I haven't been listening to the final word of the great cricketer, so I don't know what they're saying or what the information that they're putting out there is. But you say, why do all Western journalists believe this? Well, Asian journalists are writing about this too, right? Like, we know that the pitch happened. Did India cheat? I just want to get back to that one. This is a really interesting concept because, as I said, if the team wasn't involved in this, and I don't know, but I don't think they were. Just if they were, I just think they would have got pitches that would have suited them even more. Right? They would have known exactly what to ask for. I could be wrong. Maybe they did ask for it and the groundsman just couldn't do it, because sometimes that happens as well. But it's a really, really interesting one, because technically the team, if the team did request something, I would have thought for a World Cup that would be against the idea. But I'm not sure it's actually written down that a home team can't ask for a pitch. But it is written down that the cricket boards who are making these wickets have to make them to ICC standards or results, rather than to the local cricket board. But I don't know if that means that India would have cheated, right? And I think about the relationships here of the captain and coaches and players have with a local groundsman compared to the ICC. So we had the last World Cup in Australia, and there's a game in Sydney. Pat Cummins is going to know the curator. He's going to be talking to the curator beforehand. I'm not saying he's asked for a pitch or hasn't asked for a pitch. I'm exactly the same as I'm not with India, because we just don't know that, those sorts of things. I find it hard to believe that, in 2019 in the World Cup, in 2015, all these different World Cups, that home players aren't talking to their curators and maybe suggesting things. I just find that hard to believe in general. So I don't know if that is cheating, but it's not the way that these World Cups are supposed to be run. But if we're going to go through all the different ways that these World Cups aren't supposed to be run the rest of our life. All right. Let us have a break. And then after the break, we will come back and we'll be doing some chats. There's already a few questions in, a few super chats and a few normal ones, but I'm Jarrod Kimber, and this is the Wagon Wheel podcast. Want to have live chats with me, or just connect with other cricket fans on Discord that also enjoy my content, or a few AMAs? Maybe you want early podcast episodes or ad-free content, or want to receive my emailer. You can get all of this on our Patreon, plus a little bit of behind the scenes stuff as well. Huge thanks to everyone who has supported us on Patreon so far. You are all part of this channel's success. All right. Thank you to everyone on Patreon there for helping out as well. And let's get to some of the chats. Some of the questions in the chat. Bloody bugger. Who owns the media rights to World Series cricket? If Nine Entertainment for profit public company with shareholders, why can't I stream all the matches? World Series cricket, I would have assumed would be owned by Channel 9. I don't think because it's a for-profit public company with shareholders means you can stream it, though, because they still own those rights, don't they? But I would assume that they would own them, but I'm not an expert on that, because it's obviously a very different kind of league. But I can't imagine that Cricket Australia would have bought the streaming, or not the streaming in those days, but the media rights in those days to a league that had already existed, because no one ever thought that would be worth anything, right? So Channel 9 would do it, but I don't see why you think that means you should be able to stream the matches. Don't get me wrong. I think obviously you should be able to share cricket highlights and put things up and everything. But I mean, from a legal perspective, I don't know why you would think that a for-profit public company with shareholders means that you could stream it, because they still own it. They still want to make money for their company. I mean, I would argue that you could stream it and they could claim back the Google ads, and everyone would be in a better position. But hey, that's not how things work in cricket. Why would we want to make the game more popular? Sukant says, really enjoyed your Test cricket book. Thank you very much. Fire in Babylon was very good as well. By the way, Fire in Babylon, the book, is brilliant if you haven't read it. What other cricket books do you recommend? I read Edging Towards Darkness, but felt a little bit dry. I don't think I've read that one. I think Usman Samiuddin's Unquiet Ones is certainly worth reading. Nicholas Brooks' book on Sri Lanka, which I should remember the name, but he's won like 1 million awards for. I think is absolutely brilliant. What else do I like? Tim Wigmore, Freddie Wild, Matt Roller, Nathan Lehman, Ben Jones books, of which there's 3 or 4 combined now. There's some really, really good books there as well. In fact, Tim Wigmore has another book coming out on Test cricket, which he's assured me he's trying to make very different to mine, which I think is going to be really, really interesting from the chats that we've had of recent times. What are some of the other books I like? I always found some of the old player diaries in Ed Cowan and Akash Chopra's player diaries are really interesting. Very honest accounts of being a player. I've got the Bob Woolmer book behind me at all times. Trying to think if there's anything else off the top of my head that people should definitely read. Yeah, I mean, those are the ones. Christian Ryan's book, Golden Boy, is certainly another one. The World Series cricket one by Gideon Haig is really, really interesting. I'll get the name wrong, and we mentioned it on a podcast like a day ago. Unveiling Jazba, I want to say, about Pakistan women. I thought that was fascinating book. Yeah, I think that is the ones I can remember off the top of my head. But thank you very much, Sukant, for the super chat. Natesh says, out of all the discussions you've ever had on Red Inca podcast, which ones have you enjoyed the most? Enjoyed. I mean, I think Mark Coles is the best episode we've ever done. It really upset me that more people didn't listen to that. I don't know if you would say that you enjoy a conversation like that with Mark Coles. We've had a couple of, obviously, people break down on the podcast before. Kind of my thing as a documentary maker, right, sort of coming through there, when you can kind of see that coming and you allow people space to do themselves, and it almost becomes more like therapy. But I don't know if those are enjoyable. I think they may be some of the best episodes, but I don't know if they're necessarily enjoyable. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I love talking to Manoj Badali. I thought that was, just to get an owner on and just be able to sort of poke at them a little bit and chat to them, I thought was really, really fascinating. Talking to Shan Masood about stuff that me and him talk about off air, I thought was very illuminating. That's another one that I think people should go. Abhinav Mukund was, again, I don't know because of the word enjoyed, Natesh, if I'm answering them correctly. But those are, I suppose, some of my favorite ones. Yeah. I've done so many episodes. I really like the Harsha one. I'm glad that the Harsha one has done really well on YouTube and on the podcast. And I'm really glad, because Harsha was a bit reticent to come on, for the same reason I'm often reticent about going on cricket podcasts, because they always ask me the same questions. How did you get in? Blah, blah, blah. And what do you think has happened since Death of a Gentleman? And all these sorts of things. And Harsha probably, gets 1,000 times the amount of requests that I would get. So I went out of my way to come up, and Subhash helped me with this as well. But I went out of my way to come up with something that he'd never talked about before, that really allowed him. And there was like one interview I found where he just spoke about something for like 1.5 minutes. And I expanded that into a whole episode. And then, of course, Harsha then interviews me at the end. Harsha doesn't like being the one who's being interviewed, and he flips around. So that was quite, a fun situation to be in. I can tell you the one that worked the least was probably Chris Broad, who I thought I had some really interesting questions for, and just I don't know what the situation was, but just really didn't want to engage in anything. I love giving people their first go as well. I think I've been a lot of people's first podcast, and so that's really cool. But I love that show. Arco says, just had my ACL surgery. Wondering, has there ever been a fast bowler who retained their pace after ACL surgery? I can't think of fast bowlers who've had ACL. Now, I'm sure they have, and I'm just not thinking of the bowler. I would have thought, Arco, that you run in a straight line as a seam bowler. So unless it has something, you shouldn't really be twisting around your knee. So I would have thought that an ACL, not that it isn't an issue for a fast bowler, because it still clearly is, but I would have thought that it doesn't actually. So the problems that fast bowlers usually have is that they lose their cartilage, right? And that the actual joint gets weakened and things like that. I don't think it's a case of twisting. So batters do their ACL, sometimes running between wickets. Fielders often do their ACL, but I can't think of a bowler who's injured their ACL from bowling off the top of my head. It's not that common an injury in cricket either. And so therefore I can't think of anyone who has lost pace or kept pace afterwards. Darth says, will you ever get Barrett back on the podcast? Yeah, look, the thing with Barrett is when he tours, he's just a disorganized dude, right? And so we wanted a sense of consistency with it. Also, I couldn't. Barrett was originally paid through 99.94. When I went solo, I couldn't afford to pay him straight away, and so he did what he did. Look, I think me and Barrett think about cricket on a very similar level, and so we, it's a different kind of podcast than it would be with other people that I bring in. But we've got Bayram, we've got Estelle, Barrett, George Dobell, Andy Zaltzman are people that I would still love to have regular shows with as well. I'm trying to think of someone else I want to work with. I'm sure there's other people as well. There's a couple of former players, or even current players that I've had chats with about, bringing them on. That I'd love to be in a situation where that happens as well. Yeah, I mean, whether it would be a podcast or a YouTube show or whatever that may be, the idea of doing that, the problem is that because cricket doesn't have a normal time zone, and that most of us aren't in the same time zone as each other, finding a way to do it consistently every week is tricky. And me and Barrett found that for a little while, and then obviously it slipped away. He sent me a message the other day. I think he still wants to get the band back together. I love talking to Barrett about cricket. So for me, it's almost a cheat, right? It gives me an opportunity to talk to him about cricket when we don't always get to talk about cricket in a way that we would if we were just hanging around. So, I once had a podcast with Gideon Haig as well. Like, there's lots of people I would love to get back on. Again, I think the most important thing is we still want to supercharge the podcast network. Whether it now might be a little bit different. So we might end up with a couple of podcast streams into the future where, there's one episode a day on stuff that's more me based. So like the stuff we have now. And then there might be a, I don't know, Jarrod Kimber and Friends, the Sips Corden podcast type thing, right? Where we have, I have one day with Barrett, one day with, what's his name? Zaltzman, one day with someone like Dobell, one day with a former player, whatever. But I'm having these conversations and I love talking to these people and I would like to talk to them more, but all these things are a little bit tricky. Why are IPL teams purchasing teams in other leagues and paying players above market and operating at a loss since TV rights aren't as high as the IPL? What's the end game? Will they ever make money? The end game is that they will own all of cricket, and so that they can dictate what these players do forever. If they don't do that, then another owner is going to come in and pay a player a good amount of money, and then they have a say in that player, how that player develops, all that sort of stuff. Also, having all these other leagues, it doesn't matter if they lose a little bit of money because they're development leagues, right? So they're developing their staff. Everyone from their social media person on up is being developed and is doing stuff. You can't have a league that only exists for 2 months. And these teams are working that out now. They're trying to, look at, eventually they will want a Mumbai Indians TV channel and, all these different things that will come off that. And the only way to be able to do that is to have all these different things. So yeah, I think that's a big reason why they do all that sort of stuff. Also, what if the SA League does get big? Now they own a chunk of it. What if Major League Cricket does get big? Well, now they own a chunk of it. So they're ahead of the game again. Shriram says, I've started to watch NBA recently. It's difficult to follow from India with time zones. It's difficult from the UK with time zones. If one wants to understand the different stats involved in the NBA, where would be a good start? What would be a good starting point? If you go to Basketball Reference, they have normal stats. It's counting stats, averages per game, per 100 possessions, advanced stats, all the way through. And if you click on the little bit at the top, each stat is explained, I believe, if I remember correctly. It's a very good place to go. If you're looking for podcasts or, things like that, there's the Thinking Basketball, which is probably my favorite podcast at the moment. There's also another stats website in basketball. Let me just open my app that also talks about now, what is this one called? Basketball Index, which is another stats page about basketball, which has a podcast that talks more about the advanced stuffs. That one is, I think, Thinking Basketball is more philosophical discussions about basketball using advanced stats. And I would say the B-Ball Index podcast, which is this one guy on his own who does a great job, it's a little bit, you might need to know a little bit more, but it's really, really focused on stats. And he does usually try and explain each stat when he's using it. So if you're looking at those things specifically, those are two very good places to go. Look, I think you just have to kind of dive deep into it a little bit and then go from that. There's also people like, if you want to match it up with video, Sam Fassini and Mo Dakil, we'll sort of back up stats with the video, which sometimes help. It's hard when you listen to some of the basketball podcasts, the same way that people have trouble when they come to our channel, like, so we're suddenly talking about soft hands or, whatever it may be. And that doesn't make any sense to anyone. And, basketball channel, they're talking about a split horns action. And you're like, oh, what now? And it is a little bit confusing, that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think those are good places to start. Arco says, a cricket equivalent of Nikola Jokic. Oh, God. I think I've been asked this before. So you'd need someone that no one really rated who went on to be the best in the world. That's really rare, right? Like, most of the best players were rated at a fairly young age. I mean, is Jimmy Anderson an interesting one? Because in Jimmy Anderson, you have someone who didn't really come through the English system. And then one year just started bowling quicker. And the next year was playing first-class cricket. And then goes on to have this incredible career. I mean, he's not like Joker in that he didn't dominate as early as Joker. So maybe he's not in that way. The truth is that most cricketers are in some kind of a system that we know about. And so the Serbian system, even though we should know about it, is a little bit taken away from everything else. But Joker was still in the system, but then he wasn't rated specifically by the NBA when he was 18. So there's probably a cricketer who's in the cricket system who at the age of 18 perhaps can't get in. Yeah, but then you'd still have to go on to be the best player by the time you're 25. Yeah, it's a hard one just because I think in Serbia they knew how good he was, but the NBA briefly didn't. And we don't really have that system in cricket. So everyone is so hyped and everything else. So if you look at the players over the last 5 or 10 years, or last 30 or 40 years who've been the best player in the world, most of them have been thought at some stage to have been a freak. Is Adam Gilchrist a really good example, perhaps, of someone like Joker or was Adam Gilchrist just a late developer? which is slightly different than Joker again. It's a great question. I'm not sure I can answer it. Happy says, nobody talked pitches in 2019 World Cup. How come when it's India, it's always about pitches? Well, India have been really honest and said that they are making their pitches, for themselves at home. Happy, right? Like, which I appreciate. In the test games, they've said, we've made our pitches suit our bowlers more, and we'll do it again. So that, to begin with, is really important. I think the last Ashes, there was lots of talks about England making wickets that would help them, and then weirdly, the first pitch didn't seem to help them at all. There's plenty of talk about England wickets all the time. I hear so much stuff about England wickets. I always find this weird when I get told this. I'm like, really? Because every time there's a green top in England, I'll get a million messages about the wicket. So I almost as many as I do when there's a ragging pitch and a Western team has struggled in Asia. No one taught pitches in 2019 World Cup. Yeah, I think if you look back on it, it's quite clear that England didn't get the sort of pitches that they probably would have wanted in that tournament. They wanted really flat batting pitches in that tournament, and it wasn't that kind of tournament at all, right? Like, the ICC made them a little bit more English, which is weirdly not what England had been preparing for. That's probably why you didn't hear it. But if you want to know why you heard it, Happy, it's because they changed a wicket for a World Cup semi-final, right? That's why you're hearing it. The biggest pitch story in England cricket when it comes to ICC events was that a used pitch was used at Cardiff in the Champions Trophy semi-final. And that was seen not to have helped the England team at home. And that was the story at that stage. From that point of view, that comes up. But yeah, I mean, India has talked about helping their wickets before, and then a World Cup semi-final, the pitch change, and a World Cup final, clearly there is at least thought that something happened with the wicket. But you're asking why people haven't talked about it. It's because it literally was a major part of this tournament, and it was not a major part of the 2019 tournament. I don't think it was a major part of the 2015 tournament. But your general point is probably more, why do we always talk about Asian pitches, which we talked about on Uncovered yesterday or the day before, whenever it was. And what I would say about that is, in 1987, there was lots of concerns about having a World Cup in Asian conditions because of the wickets and everything else. So there is a bias by the Western teams against those conditions at times, and I do think it comes up. But Happy, there was changes to these wickets. You can't argue that, right? And that wasn't the case for the wickets during the 2019 World Cup. You cannot compare those two things. I'm sorry. It's disingenuous. Andrew says, should Kuhnemann move away from Queensland to get more first-class cricket? And who should be involved in the decision besides Kuhnemann himself? Well, the problem with this, Andrew, is then the same thing always ends up happening, which is all the spinners end up in New South Wales, right? And then they can't all play anyway. I mean, yes, Kuhnemann probably shouldn't play in those conditions. But I don't really know how you handle that. It's a very similar problem to what happens in England, right? Like, everyone ends up in Somerset if they're a spinner, and then all the spinners can't play in Somerset, so they have to go somewhere else anyway. Do you really want Kuhnemann moving to another state, finding that he's now fighting with someone else? I just think they need to work out how to develop him correctly. And in some ways, Andrew, I would suggest that him bowling on the least hospitable surfaces might also help him round his game out a little bit. Whether they want to do that or not is also the other question. DM95 says, only nominally a cricket question, but is the LeBron... Geez, we've had a lot of basketball in this episode. But is the LeBron versus Jordan debate quite similar to what you've described with Tendulkar versus Lara or Steyn versus Anderson in terms of longevity and having a 20-year player? Look, I think that's only a recent thing with the LeBron versus Jordan debate. LeBron versus Jordan debate started really, really early on, right? So it was well before it was longevity. But yeah, so we, in the middle of making this book about the 50 best test batters, we're looking at Kallis's record versus Tendulkar's. And I think you can make an argument that Kallis's record is at least close to being on par to Tendulkar's when you factor in all the different things. And Kallis was just a fantastic player. But the longevity of it is extraordinary. You know, when you think of how long India had a player of Tendulkar's a record, and if you have two players even with a similar record, it's hard not to pick the one who's played for longer, even if they have lower peaks than the other player, even if they're not quite as good as the other player, just because if you get an extra 6 or 7 years out of someone, that's extraordinary, right? And, you know, I think the LeBron one is slightly different at the moment, just because you're talking about a player who is doing something at an age that no one has ever done before. And so, you know, generally you get to your late 30s, you know, and your 40s in basketball, and you're scoring 3 points a game, right? Even great players are really struggling to score, you know, double digits past their 37th, 38th birthday. And he's clearly, you know, probably still top 15 players in the NBA. And as we saw with the play-in tournament, you know, won the tournament and would probably still win playoffs if it wasn't for the fact that him and Anthony Davis look exhausted by the end of every season. So that is slightly different, I think, in that conversation, because you're now talking about a player who has extended his peak years to a point of which most players will never be able to do. I don't think that's entirely what Sachin does, right? So if you look at Sachin Tendulkar's record, I would say that he hasn't quite extended his peak. What he did is extended his career. So let's have a look here. Yeah, so 2011, he averages 47, then he averages 23, then he averages 34. So he has, and then at the start of his career, he averages 35, 41, 19, 41, right? So what's that? 7 years of being more of a replacement, well, slightly above, let's say slightly above replacement level batter. And then he has, so that's 7 years. And then he has what? It was 1989, so 24 years in total. So then he has 17 years of great numbers. And I know he has the odd bad year in there occasionally, but it's usually, you know, smaller amounts of games in those years. So it's a bit more variable. But essentially he has 17 years where he is a great batter and, you know, automatically in the top 3 batters in the world for most of that time, right? If not number 1 for great periods of that time as well. So you now have 17 years of him as a great player, and you have 7 years of him as a role player, let's say, right? Solid role player. How do you compare that to, let's go into Callis's career for a minute. So Callis starts in 1995, but really doesn't start playing till 1997. And then he finishes in 2013, right? So that's 16 years. He has 2 years at the start where he is under par. So he has, let's say, 15 years of peak performance, right? And 2 years of, again, role player performance, right? So that is, what do we say? 7, 14. So it's about, let's say it's 1 more year. I can't remember my maths from Sachin from a moment ago now, but let's say it's 1 more year of peak performance than Sachin did. And let's say he was 5% better than Sachin at his best than Sachin was. I'm not saying he was, but I'm saying just for the argument's sake to make this. Doesn't the 7 years of role player that Sachin gave you still give you a huge amount of extra stuff from that point of view, right? And this is more the, you know, the LeBron versus Jordan debate. It's the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar debate in basketball as well, right? So Kareem Abdul-Jabbar gives you so much, you know, different parts of his career. He has, you know, the great defensive years when he first starts. Then he has, you know, the great offensive years, and then he has the, oh my God, how many seasons did he actually play? So he played 20 seasons, right? And then you have the last couple of years where he plays as a role player. So you get Kareem Abdul-Jabbar gives you 17. Yeah, he probably gives you about 17 years of a top 15 player, and then he gives you 3 years as a role player, right? And you go, and then you compare it to Michael Jordan, who, again, as we just talked about, didn't play as long as some of these other guys. Also had a rest in the middle of his career twice, 2 retirements during his career. And so these are the things that it depends on what you care about, DM, right? If your idea of the best player in the world is someone who had the highest peak, then you could make a serious argument that Brian Lara is probably the best batter of all time. But if you factor in his entire career, you might have Brian Lara. We certainly would have him behind Tendulkar. You might have him a little bit behind or around the same area as Ricky Ponting, right? So maybe he's now struggling or he's probably in the top 10, right? Rather than being automatically in the top 3. But if you peak, I think you can make an argument that him at his peak was better than anyone else. You've got other players who will end up with higher averages than all of these guys, right? The Adam Voges thing. But Adam Voges never had to play when he was young, and he never had to play when he was washed, which Ricky Ponting and Sachin Tendulkar both had to do, right? Again, Callis came in and then was taken back out the side. He didn't have. Callis probably has a 1995, he plays 1 test. 1996, he plays 1 test. If he plays, I don't know how many tests South Africa played, but if he plays, let's say, 12 or 14 tests in that time, but clearly isn't ready yet, he might end up averaging, 15 in that time. So his overall average then would drop quite a bit. This is why it's subjective, and this is why it's hard to actually tell. And you have to go on what you personally like and what you do. And I suppose what me and Cheyenne are trying to do is really just come up with, I'm trying to think of the wording, but we're just really trying to come up with a fair way of looking at all the different information. Our own biases will come into it, and Abhishek will be working on Mukherjee will be working on the project with this as well. So his biases will come in. Sometimes we'll weight stories. There are certain players who I think are very important to cricket, who I think because of that fact should be bumped up higher. I think Javed Miandad's batting is still affecting cricket today. And I think, in white ball cricket and in red ball cricket. And I think because of that, you have to judge his impact compared to Mike Hussey's impact, who really didn't have an impact on the way that cricket is played, but is still going to end up with a much better average than Javed Miandad. But Mike Hussey, when he was young and coming through the game, didn't have to play a test cricket. He was dropped by Western Australia at a time when Sachin Tendulkar already had lots of test hundreds, right? And so Mike Hussey is still going to end up with, a very, very good record. So what's his average? 51.52. And Sachin Tendulkar, his average is, I should know that, shouldn't I? 53.78, right? So you could say that Hussey's not that much worse a cricketer than Sachin Tendulkar or than Viv Richards. But those guys had to play when they were young and then also had to play well later than they probably should have with lots of miles on the clock. And Mike Hussey didn't have to deal with any of those sorts of things. So that's how we try and factor all these things together. And it's endlessly fascinating, as hopefully this discussion has shown you. I think... to go back to the Thinking Basketball podcast, they did their top 50 players of all time. And I would eventually want to get to a point where I can do the same within cricket. So we want to start with test batters. We'll then do, probably test spinners, test seamers, even test wicket keepers, although that may not be as big a project, but that would also be another project that we will look at. To then have a look at how we rate different players and what we think their importance is. 2 sides overall, how these things go. And then within that, so then within that, we will have a situation where we can try and get to that. But we're trying to factor in as many different things as possible, sometimes without the information for some of the older players. How do you compare Jack Hobbs, who plays for 30 years, but doesn't play a lot of test matches, to someone like Mike Hussey, who played an awful lot of test matches, but, in a small period of time, right? All these things are what we are trying to get to the bottom of and everything else. But it's a fascinating exercise with all that considered. All right, that's me done. It's a long wagon wheel. I shouldn't do them in the morning. I've got too much energy, guys. Too much energy. After a long run off everything today. Thank you so much to everyone for all of your questions and support. What was it? What was this? The wagon wheel. So what have I got next coming up? We got a red inker. What's red inker on? It was a really fascinating. Oh, red inker's on Wrongans, which is really, really cool. Bayram had to go in, but we've got a couple of videos coming out. We've got a video on Australian legacy. We've got a video on what's happening in Sri Lankan cricket over the last month or so, I suppose. Another video on matchup. So we've got a couple of really long videos coming out shortly on all those different topics. Please, if you can support us on Patreon, that is great. But everyone, liking and subscribing and doing all those things really, really helps us. I'm Jarrod Kimber. This is Wagon Wheel, and I'll talk to you again next time. Picture this. You made a video, and now you want the world to see it in their favorite social media platform. You could bowl into the wind by slaving away making edits, or you could let Memento effortlessly cut those epic moments down, making them perfect for your social media followers. It's like having a runner. You play the shot, and they do all the hard work. Sync up your podcast and YouTube, and they will be the substitute fielder who does all of the work. With Memento, you can craft a long innings down to the best highlights. Make your content, but let Memento cut it. If you enjoy our content, we ask you to hit the like button, subscribe, or drop a comment along the lines of, "Wow, Jarrod, your vibes are immaculate." Additionally, sharing our work on social media, supporting us in super chats, and helping us out on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee all mean the world to us. Like our stuff? Please support us by whacking that subscribe button like it's a short ball. Or you could just leave a comment expressing your admiration, such as, "Wow, Jarrod, you're the Aubrey Faulkner of YouTubers." Also, please help us spread the word by sharing our work across social media, back us on Patreon, or also support us with live super chats.